We're going hopping today, where things are popping. The Philadelphia way, we're gonna drop it. On all the music they play on the bandstand. We're going swinging, we're gonna swing in the crowd, and we'll be clinging and floating high as a cloud. The phones are ringing, my mom and dad are so proud. I'm on bandstand, and I'll jump and hey, I may even show them my handstand. Because I'm on.
Those are the introductory song of Dick Clark's American Bandstand, the great show that served as the television way of getting rock and roll out to the American nation. Dick Clark, of course, as you know, who had the Rockin' New Year's celebration until he passed away and unfortunately has been succeeded by Ryan Seacrest. Was the longtime host of the show and then the host of the $20,000 Pyramid shows, which are now back into production. They're doing it again. But these are the sounds of the 50s, ladies and gentlemen, and they are an important part of the post-war era, the life of the post-war era around the burbs and cultural life of the 50s, and the beginning of the civil rights movement. And then I Like Ike, followed by Duck and Cover, and then a very important part of the culture of the 1950s, race, rock, and Elvis. What you see there is an advertisement for the cookie-cutter style homes of the suburbs called Levittown. That was a company. Levitt was a company that created the suburbs. How did the suburbs come to be? We need to figure that out. That's very important. It helps underscore how American history progressed in the 1950s and the 1960s. In order to understand how the suburbs worked and how the suburbs grew, you need to understand the Servicemen's Readjustment Act of 1944, better known as the GI Bill of Rights. What was the GI Bill of Rights? One of the most marvelous examples of socialism and social policy that has ever existed in United States history. It was dedicated payments of tuition and living expenses to attend high school, college, or vocational technical school. They were not going to have the same problem that the World War I veterans had. The World War I veterans had that cash bonus that was deferred over time, which meant that during the Depression, money that they could have had was kept locked away. This time, the American Legion especially says no, and they help write the bill. It provides some low-cost mortgages for homes, low-interest loans to start a business or to go into farming, 1 year of unemployment compensation if they cannot find a job. And it protected their jobs when they went away to war. That meant that if they went away to war and they left their job, they came back, they were entitled to that job. My grandfather actually got fired from it, and he did not pursue it. He could have gotten a lot of money out of that as well. The GI Bill was written mostly for white soldiers coming home, however. There's a dark side to the GI Bill. It was not as effective for minorities. Banks would not give African Americans certain loans to buy homes in certain areas. But what the GI Bill does do is that it helps the returning soldiers to settle down and to buy homes. Home ownership. That was considered to be the key. But then the real estate lobby gets a hold of the GI Bill, and they have a clause written into that to say, well, in order to make the economy even better, we need to have new home ownership. In other words, you couldn't come back and get a loan to get your family's house in the old neighborhood or get that unique fixer-upper or so forth. No. You had to use your GI Bill for new home construction. And new home construction meant building homes where there were no homes before that. And this is how the suburbs came to be. This is how urban sprawl comes to be. Is that the GIs build their homes out in the suburbs because that's where you built new homes. And so they settle down. And what do GIs do when they come back from war, when they've been fighting for a long time? And by the way, it wasn't just for combat soldiers. Anybody who wore the uniform has the GI Bill. Well, they get home, and what do? They settle down, and they get busy. And by that I mean they start having kids. They marry, they start having kids. It's called the baby boom. The baby boom is all those that were born after 1945 until about probably the mid-1950s. That's the baby boom generation. That increased the dependency ratio. Now, what do I mean by the dependency ratio? The dependency ratio means the number of people that are in your household that are underage and are not able to work the full-time jobs because they're going to school and so forth, or they are elderly and they're not able to work anymore, which meant that those that were of working age had to work longer hours, tougher hours, and they settled down into this life, but it's not the idyllic life. There is problems behind the picket fences of the homes, and that is a rise in the divorce rates eventually begin to show up. You see, many people wrongly assume that the idyllic life of the 1950s with the wife at home baking cookies and husband going to the office and then coming home and he's got 2 or 3 kids, that was considered to be, by many people, the way it should have been. Actually, that's radical. That's the radical model. This was something that was artificially created. People are settling down and women are staying at home to be homemakers, and they're not doing it because they really want to do it. They're doing it because they feel it's their American duty to do so, to show the strength of capitalism and to fight communism, to have a good home life and not have women in the workplace and so forth. But it was a strain because it was radical and it was very artificial. So when anybody comes and tells you, well, we need to go back to the way things were in the 50s because that was the traditional way. No, it was not traditional by a long shot. Now, I'm not disparaging it. It worked for a lot of people, believe me. But it didn't work for everybody. And that's the important thing to understand here. So now that people have settled down in the 1950s, what is their cultural life like? Well, first of all, it's reacclimation to peacetime. Soldiers have been at war, now they're coming home. So here you have movies like The Best Years of Our Lives that you see in the upper right-hand corner, starring Frederick March on the right, Dana Andrews in the middle, and Harold Russell, who had both of his arms amputated during the war. And he was an actual veteran, and it shows about how these 3 men dealing with post-traumatic stress and difficult home situations and trying to adjust to life without arms and so forth, how it weighs on these 3 individual men who all become friends on their way home from the war. Then you have a movie like A Bad Day at Black Rock that you see there with Spencer Tracy sitting in the chair and Lee Marvin as one of the bullying sheriff's deputies and Dean Jagger over on the right, about a war veteran coming back to visit a man in a town who was a Japanese American, but he is not there. He's dead, and the whole town has a terrible, terrible secret that they're sharing in this. And it has one of the greatest beatdown scenes of all times when Spencer Tracy beats the living dog crap out of Ernest Borgnine in a bar. You also had, because of the communist scare of the time, fear of invasion. Remember, we were worried about the Soviets. We were worried about communist infiltrators taking us over. So we had movies like a lot of science fiction style movies. We had The Day the Earth Stood Still, Klaatu Barata Nikto. We had Them, a story about giant ants who have been changed by the atomic tests. You have Invasion of the Body Snatchers. This really speaks to communist invasion as aliens coming to Earth take over your body and you become soulless and lifeless, and they come in the form of pods that will then mimic your body. And The Thing from Another World. The Thing from Another World about alien invasion in the North Pole, in the Arctic regions. This is also an age of television. Now, television had existed all the way back in the 1920s, but now people are coming home to dinner. And they're sitting around the television set. And of course, television sets back then were about the size of your 40-inch plasma screens. The only problem was is that much of that was a wood console with all sorts of machinery in it, and it had a very small, maybe 12 to 14-inch screen. People back then said, "Oh, we got a nice 19-inch screen," and everybody, "Whoa, that was big." Yeah. Well, what did people watch? They watched shows that talked about post-war life. Father Knows Best, Ozzie and Harriet, Leave It to Beaver. Oh yes, the Beav. This is all about the suburban home where mother and father are there. Dad is the font of wisdom, and mother is the calm support, and the children are just trying to find their way through the world with the help of their parents. All is good in the end. And there's another side to the story. There's the urban side to the story. For just 39 episodes, The Honeymooners ran, but what a 39 episodes they were. Most magnificent show of the time. Talked about the rough and tumble life of the city and tenement living, and dealing with always the underlying threat of spousal abuse. Where Jackie Gleason, Ralph Cramton saying, "Oh, I'm going to send you to the moon, Alice. Bang, zoom." This was television in the 1950s. In the upper left, you see actor Kevin McCarthy on the couch, as one of the producers holds the seed pod from Invasion of the Body Snatchers. Out of that pod would grow a figure that would then take on the same exact shape and size of the person. In the middle, you see Them, the giant ant of Them. My mother said it was the scariest movie she ever saw at the time. When she went to see it. On the right-hand side is an actor who actually appeared in Them, and then he played the creature in The Thing. James Arness was The Thing. James Arness would later go on and become Marshal Matt Dillon in Gunsmoke. And at the bottom you see Michael Rennie as the Voyager from outer space coming to Earth in the day the Earth stood still. And behind him is the all-powerful robot Klaatu, who destroys men, and he's coming to Earth to say that they better get their house in order, and if not, they're going to find themselves destroyed by more than just nuclear destruction. Here are your major TV shows and their stars. In the upper left, you have Ozzie and Harriet Nelson, with their two sons David at the top and Eric, known as Ricky Nelson. Ricky Nelson would go on to a successful career as a recording artist. He recorded Poor Little Fool and Garden Party. And then he married Chris Harmon, the daughter of Heisman Trophy winner Tom Harmon, and the older sister of actor Mark Harmon, better known as Leroy Jethro Gibbs on NCIS. Ricky Nelson had a history of drug problems that he and Kristen were in, and then Ricky Nelson died in a plane crash on December the 31st, 1985, going to an Aid concert. Upper center, Hugh Beaumont and Tony Dow, Barbara Billingsley, and slouched down sitting is Jerry Mathers of Leave It to Beaver, one of the great, well-recognized theme songs. In the upper right, you have Donna Reed of The Donna Reed Show, with Carl Betts as her husband in the show, and her two children, Paul Peterson and Shelley Fabaris. Shelley Fabares was one of those child actors that made it to become an adult actor. She would go on and star as the wife of Craig T. Nelson in the TV series Coach. The lower left, you have Robert Young as the star of Father Knows Best, with Jane Wyatt as his wife, Eleanor Donahue as his eldest daughter Betty, Billy Gray as his son, and Lauren Chapin as his youngest daughter Kitten. Robert Young would go on to another great TV series, Marcus Welby, M.D. Jane Wyatt would be a frequent guest in many shows, but probably her most famous guest role was that of Mr. Spock's mother in the Star Trek TV series, and then in the movies. Eleanor Donahue also made a guest appearance on Star Trek and was frequently, for one season, on the Andy Griffith Show. In the lower right, you have the cast of The Honeymooners. Ralph Cramden was played by Jackie Gleason, a.k.a. the Great One. And then you had Audrey Meadows as his patient, but sometimes irascible wife, Alice. Art Carney as his friend Ed Norton, who worked in the sewer, and Joyce Randolph. Norton and Trixie lived upstairs above the Cramdens in their apartment, and it's about their many different adventures and schemes and so forth. The 50s is also a time of great literature that comes out. Because it is the age of the atomic bomb and so forth, there was a great deal of science fiction. Remember, we had the German rockets of World War II, the atomic bomb, so you have Isaac Asimov going out and going to the stars. And then you had Arthur C. Clarke, who wrote 2001, A Space Odyssey, 2010, Odyssey 2, 2061, an Odyssey 3, and 3001, The Final Odyssey, which tells a somewhat interesting twist on extraterrestrial visitors to Earth and the origins of humanity's climb above all the other creatures of the Earth. I highly recommend 2001 more than any of the other books, but all four of them are excellent, and they're all very well tied together. You had fantasy writers of the time. J.R.R. Tolkien had published The Hobbit in 1937, and then he comes out with the sequel to The Hobbit, The Lord of the Rings, in 1954. And suddenly subways throughout all America and places, bulletin boards and so forth, had Frodo Lives on it. You had novels like Hemingway, The Old Man and the Sea, a great novel of the 1950s. And you had theater. Theater oftentimes reflected the Red Scare more than anything, because those in the theater empathized with those in Hollywood. And so you had films like The Crucible, which talked about the Salem witch trials, but it's really a polemic on the Red Scare. And you also had Inherit the Wind, which is the story of the Scopes monkey trial with the names changed, but it is adapted to show the Red Scare again. And there you see the actor Frederick March one more time being cross-examined by Spencer Tracy. And they are the William Jennings Bryan and Clarence Darrow figures. And if you notice the judge sitting behind them, that's Harry Morgan, who achieved fame later on in Dragnet and in the TV series MASH. Here are some of the great books of the 1950s. In the upper left-hand corner is The Catcher in the Rye by J.D. Salinger. That's a book that is frequently targeted by fundamentalist Christians and extreme rightists to remove them from libraries and even burn them at times. In the lower center is Fahrenheit 451 by Ray Bradbury, which is a polemic against burning books. Fahrenheit 451 is the temperature at which books will incinerate, or paper will incinerate. It's a story of a dystopian futuristic society where no one is supposed to be reading books, just listening to government-produced pablum and information. But there are little pockets of libraries throughout, secret libraries, underground libraries, illegal libraries, and the firemen are not there to put out fires. They're there to start the fires. Whenever they find a library, they will burn it. The upper center is William Golding's Lord of the Flies, the story of a young group of boys who crash land on an island in the wake of a nuclear war, and they attempt to set up a society, a working society on the island. And all I will tell you, for those that haven't read, it is an epic fail. And finally, last but not least, Ayn Rand's Atlas Shrugged, which is a darling of the current conservative movement. And the writer-producer John Rogers once described the difference between The Lord of the Rings and Atlas Shrugged. He said, one is a childish fantasy that offers engenders a lifelong obsession with its unbelievable heroes, leading to an emotionally stunted, socially crippled adulthood, unable to deal with the world. The other, of course, involves orcs. And as with some of the books, you also had challenges to the culture. And challenges to the culture came from what was known as the Beat Generation. What is the Beat Generation? This is a group of people who rejected standard narrative values, engaged on spiritual quests, oftentimes of the Eastern religious variety, or even of American religions like Indian religions. They rejected materialism. They had explicit portrayals of the human condition, which was often not very flattering, often comical. They experimented or advocated experimenting with psychedelic drugs. They engaged in sexual liberation and exploration. Their chief apostle was the writer Jacques Kerouac, who wrote about the Beat Generation probably more than anybody. You also had Hugh Hefner in Playboy. This was definitely countercultural, talking about a hedonistic style of lifestyle. You had Allen Ginsberg, who wrote the poem How, and William S. Burroughs, who wrote the book The Naked Lunch. Both of them were sued for or charged with obscenity, and the Supreme Courts and the federal courts frequently struck it down and said, no, this is free expression. What did the Beats do? Well, they were rejecting the Cold War status quo. They especially were rejecting the fact that we were teetering on the brink of nuclear war and the nuclear arms race. And they advocated racial segregation. Excuse me, they advocated racial integration. They were against racial segregation. Excuse me for that. What the Beats were advocating was the end of racial segregation, and this leads to the Civil Rights Movement. The Civil Rights Movement began really back in 1947 when Jackie Roosevelt Robinson was the first black player in Major League Baseball in the 20th century. Branch Rickey, the general manager of the Brooklyn Dodgers, chose Jackie Robinson over a number of other people who may have been a little bit more talented, but he wanted Robinson. And he made Robinson sign a deal that for 3 years he couldn't fight or talk back in any way. And he endured some serious abuse. The manager of the Philadelphia Phillies would not even take a picture shaking Robinson's hand. He would only take a picture with him with the bat, holding the bat together. Robinson really ruined his health in a lot of ways from taking all that in the end, and he died at a very young age, at the age of 54. He looked like he was about 84. His hair had gone white. He was completely blind. But in the time that he was on the Dodgers, they frequently won the pennant, appeared in the World Series several times, losing to the New York Yankees, but finally beating the New York Yankees in a World Series. And what really turned the tide for Jackie Robinson in racial relations was when Dodger shortstop Pee Wee Reese went out when Jackie Robinson was taking just a tremendous amount of abuse from the fans and just simply put his arm around Robinson. And that more than anything said, okay, enough's enough. Larry Doby was the first black man in the American League. He played for the Cleveland Indians. In 1954, a young black girl by the name of Linda Brown lived 3 blocks from a school. The school was an all-white school in Topeka, Kansas. She had to walk 22 blocks to go to the black school. Mom and Dad wanted to go to the school that was closer, and so they sued. With the NAACP helping them out, this goes all the way to the Supreme Court in the Brown v. Board of Education decision. This is the Supreme Court decision that overturned 58 years of Jim Crow. It overturned the Plessy decision. It desegregated schools. However, the language of the Brown v. Board of Education decision was very, very particular and very cloudy at the same time. It said that schools must be desegregated with all deliberate speed. Now, deliberate means slow. Speed means fast. Whites focused on deliberate. Blacks focused on speed. Arguing the case before the Supreme Court was Thurgood Marshall, a leading African American and a lawyer who would eventually become a Supreme Court justice himself. The Chief Justice who issued the ruling of Brown v. Board was Earl Warren, the former Republican governor of California. Because of this, many whites in the South became enraged and joined what were called white citizen councils, more urban-oriented, city-oriented, segregationist groups that used all sorts of political legerdemain and violence and intimidation to make sure that the schools stayed segregated. And that meant they would work with the Klan and with other extremist groups. In the upper left, you see Jackie Robinson smiling as Mr. Branch Rickey, nicknamed the Mahatma, signs him to his first Major League contract. Robinson started with the Montreal Farm Club of the Dodgers and then moved to Brooklyn very quickly, and the debut garnered national attention. This could not have happened unless Judge Kennesaw Mountain Landis, an avowed racist, had died, which he had done the year before, and this led the way for Robinson to come into the major leagues. Here you see a depiction from the movie 42 with Lucas Black playing Pee Wee Reese, putting his arm around Jackie Robinson. In the lower left, you see Larry Doby, the first African-American to break into the American League, played for the Cleveland Indians. And in the center, you see Thurgood Marshall shaking hands with his fellow attorneys, celebrating the Brown v. Board of Education ruling. How bad was the racism toward Jackie Robinson? Phillies manager Ben Chapman was such a racist that he would not take a picture with Jackie Robinson shaking his hand. But he was finally coaxed to at least just take a picture with Robinson, with him holding the bat and Robinson holding the bat. And as you can tell, Robinson is putting on a brave face. Chapman, on the other hand, is looking very much like, I really don't want to be doing this. There's a great t-shirt going around. It's a black t-shirt with white writing on it, and it says simply in quotes, "Nah, Rosa Parks." Rosa Parks was a field agent for the NAACP. That is, she went out and she helped investigate a number of white racist incidents against African Americans, especially when it came to rape. You see, here's one of the big things about Jim Crow in the South, is that it was predicated on the fear that African American men would prey on white women. But in truth, it was the other way around. It was white men who preyed on African American women. And Rosa Parks, her job, when she was not being a seamstress and earning money, was to go out and help investigate these incidents of rape and sexual abuse and so forth. Rosa Parks lived in Montgomery, Alabama, and Montgomery had a very, very strict segregated bus service. Everything was segregated. This is the state of Alabama, after all. Several years before, she had had a negative experience with a white bus driver, and she vowed never to get on the bus with him again. But one time, she was sitting in the blacks section, but according to the law, when the white section filled up, blacks had to move back in the bus and open up another seat for whites. Rosa Parks said no, and for that she was arrested and charged with public disturbance and violation of segregation laws, and she was put in jail because she would not pay the fine. This leads to the Montgomery bus boycott that lasts for 380 days, from December the 5th until December the 20th, 1955 to 1956. There was an earlier boycott in Baton Rouge, done to try and underscore the Morgan v. Virginia Supreme Court ruling, which ended interstate bus travel segregation, because that was a violation of the Commerce Clause. Because of the Brown ruling, many of the bus drivers in the South would join the white citizens' councils, and they would exact all sorts of indignities against African Americans riding the bus. They would pass them up without picking them up. They would overcharge them on their transfer tickets and so forth. A teenager named Claudette Colvin was arrested. Then you had the Sarah Keys v. the Carolina Coach Company. See, many of the bus companies then enacted their own private Jim Crow laws. And again, the Supreme Court said, sorry, not going to happen. Because of what happened with Rosa Parks and because of the way African Americans were being treated in Montgomery, Martin Luther King and Reverend Ralph Abernathy called for a boycott. And this is where the whites really screwed the pooch on this one. And I'm not saying that like I'm in support of them or anything. If they had said nothing at all, the boycott may not have gotten any attention whatsoever. But they very foolishly, very stupidly went on TV and pointed their fingers at the black community and lectured them and said, we don't want any of you all taking part in this here boycott that's started by a bunch of communist agitators. You all are good people and we expect you all to act like good people. Well, that immediately drew attention to the boycott. And then violence against African Americans and their imprisonment brought national attention down. And in the height of the Cold War, this was not a good look for America to have in light of the Soviets, where they could turn and the Soviets could say, "Oh, you see, we don't have any human rights supposedly, but look at what Southern U.S. doing." The Browder v. Gale finally says enough is enough. The bus lines must be integrated. And so the bus lines are technically integrated. In truth, however, many whites in Montgomery and in other cities exacted grievous tolls on African Americans because of this. Through violence, intimidation, and so forth, virtual segregation remained. And it was an economic disaster for the South because African Americans just simply said the heck with it and carpooled when they could and brought the economy down in a number of ways.
I for president, I for president, I for president, I for president. You like Ike, I like Ike, everybody likes Ike for president. Hang out the banner and beat the drum. We'll take Ike to Washington. We don't want John or Dean or Harry. Let's do that big job right. Just get in step with the guy that's hep. Get in step with Ike. You like Ike, I like Ike, everybody likes Ike for president. Hang out the banner and beat the drum. We'll take Ike to Washington. We got to get where we are going. Travel day and night for president. Let Adelaide go the other way. We'll all go with Ike. You like Ike, I like Ike, everybody likes Ike for president. Hang out the banner, beat the drum. We'll take Ike to Washington. We'll take Ike to Washington.
Now is the time for all good Americans to come to the aid of their country.
That commercial for Dwight Eisenhower for president, by the way, was produced by none other than Roy Disney, the older brother of Walt Disney. And Dwight Eisenhower was from the American heartland. He was from Abilene, Kansas. He had gone to West Point as a young man and had proven himself to be a very popular guy, a man who certainly had a way with organizing things and organizing people. After his term at West Point, he served as adjutant under General Douglas MacArthur, then returned to West Point and became the commandant at West Point, serving there during the First World War and marrying his sweetheart, Mamie. Then he began to climb steadily in the ranks of the Army as an excellent staff officer and was chosen to be Supreme Commander of the Allied forces in Europe and was well noted for being a great mover and manipulator of men. While not being particularly strong on strategy, he had other people around him who were excellent at overall strategy. He comes home from the war, and one of the first questions that's asked of him when he comes home from the war is, "Sir, are you a Democrat or a Republican?" And he says, "I'm an American." And that's the kind of stuff that just absolutely galvanized people behind him and made him very popular. In 1952, he decided that he would run for the presidency of the United States, announced to the country that he would personally go and visit Korea. I will go to Korea to see the Korean situation. And he would eventually become the 34th president of the United States of America. Here you see the Eisenhower train as it went through town after town after town on the campaign. There you see the campaign button, Peace, Progress, and Prosperity. And there you see Ike signing the Federal Highway Act into law, create the interstate highway system. Now, our interstate highway system is significantly different from the German Autobahn system in a number of ways. Most of the German Autobahns don't go through the middle of major cities. They go outside the cities. That's just one example of how different they are. But they are very similar as well, especially in being controlled access highways. And here you see ground about to be broken on the very first interstate highway in the state of Missouri. And as you drive along interstates, you will see the signs, the 5 stars of Eisenhower being a general, the Eisenhower Interstate System. Because of massive retaliation and brinksmanship, many people became very afraid of nuclear destruction. You see it reflected in the literature. You see it reflected in many of the television shows. People then began creating fallout shelters. In fact, you'll see on many an old school building, you'll see nuclear fallout shelter. Schools had nuclear disaster drills called duck and cover. Bert the Turtle says duck and cover. Even had air raid sirens. In my neighborhood of Lakeview, when I went to St. Dominic's School as a young boy in the 70s, those air raid sirens still went off. Nobody paid any attention to them anymore, but they still went off from time to time, just as a precautionary warnings and so forth. And some people did have bomb shelters. There's a few in Lakeview if you know where to look. And that big giant mound on the neutral ground between Pontchartrain and West End is a nuclear fallout shelter. It's the old civil defense shelter. It's not used anymore, and it's filled up with water rats and mosquitoes, but it was supposed to be a nuclear disaster shelter that the National Guard would use in times of an emergency. So how did the youth deal with this? How did youth deal with the culture? They felt the stress and the strain and the tension of segregation and the bomb and so forth. They did what teenagers did. They sought their means of escape. They sought their ways of entertainment. The culture of teenagers centered very much on the automobile, the car, because you're building new highways, you're building better roads. The automobile becomes very important in the 1950s. They had comic books, which we call graphic novels today, and television as well for teenagers. And the quintessential teenage movie of the time was Rebel Without a Cause, starring the great James Dean, who made only 4 movies in his lifetime and died at the age of 24 in a car accident. James Dean made Rebel Without a Cause, and it's the story of a young man kind of disconnected from his family, trying to find his way in the world. And it's noted because the father in the movie is played by Jim Backus. And Jim Backus is the man who plays Thurston Howell on Gilligan's Island, and he's also the voice of Mr. Magoo. He does a magnificent performance in this movie. Dean made another movie with Rock Hudson called Giant, and I'm not really familiar with the other 2 movies. You'll have to just look them up. Teenagers also expressed their disdain for segregation and the bomb through the dance floor, through rock and roll. First coined by a Cleveland disc jockey named Alan Freed. Rock and roll had roots in African-American rhythm and blues music, black rhythm and blues music that was later marketed as rock and roll. Bob Saget, the very funny and somewhat dirty comedian from the TV series Full House, once had in his stand-up routine that once there was a man who had a little swivel in his hips, a little curl in his lip, and he sang a really good tune. Unfortunately, he was black and nobody listened to him, but then a few years later, Elvis came along. That is exactly how rock and roll came to be. When whites started singing rhythm and blues tunes that were adapted from black rhythm and blues, that's when rock and roll took off. There were cover records, white versions of earlier black songs. So you had people like Pat Boone, still alive by the way, kind of a nut job, Georgia Gibbs, Chuck Berry, Little Richard, Ray Charles. And then you had Dick Clark hosting American Bandstand. And perhaps the king himself, Elvis Aaron Presley, who was well known for being a teen heartthrob. Got even more popular when he was drafted into the Army and had to cut his career off for a little while. Served his time in the Army after being drafted. Came out, made more songs, made movies, and so forth. Regretfully, Elvis died much too early from an overdose of prescription painkillers.
One threw a party in the county jail. The prison band was there and they began to wail. The band was jumping and the joint began to swing. You should have heard the knocked out jailbird sing, let it rock. Everybody let it rock. Everybody in the whole cell block was dancing to the jailhouse rock. Spider Murphy played his in a saxophone. Little Joe was blowing on the slide trombone. Drummer broken out and on the crash boom bang. The whole rhythm section was a purple gang. Let's rock. Everybody let's rock. Everybody in the whole cell block was dancing to the jailhouse rock. Number 47 said to number 3, you were the cutest jailbird I ever did see. I sure would be delighted with your company. Come on and do the jailhouse rock with me. Let's rock. Go, go, go. Everybody let's rock. Lay it on me, Daddy-o. Everybody in the whole cell block was dancing to the jailhouse rock. Rock, 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 rock to the jailhouse rock. Rock, 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 rock to the jailhouse rock. Sad sack was sitting on a block of stone, way over in the corner weeping all alone. The warden said, hey buddy, don't you be no square. If you can't find a partner, use a wooden chair. Everybody let's rock. Rock, rock. Everybody in the whole cell rock was dancing to the jailhouse rock. Shifter Henry said the bugs for heaven's sake. The one's looking out a chance to make a break. Bugsy turned to Shifter and he said, nix, nix. I wanna stick around, I wanna get my kick. Everybody let's rock. Everybody in the whole cell rock was dancing to the jailhouse rock. Dancing to the jailhouse rock. Rock, rock, 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 rock. Dancing to the jailhouse rock.
It was on the dance floors that integration began to take place as African Americans and white Americans mingled together. It was on the dance floor that resistance to the bomb and the culture of the Cold War took place. Do not underestimate the power that rock and roll had, and never underestimate the power of the king.